Okay, cadets, today's the first class of the second quarter, and we are going to start talking this quarter about first aid. And this lesson today is generally goes over first aid emergencies, and we're going to talk a little bit about recognizing, how you recognize emergencies and what you need to do, what immediate steps you should take if you encounter a situation that requires the administration of first aid. So our central question is, how can you determine the need for first aid in an emergency? So what do you already know about this? Have you ever been in an emergency situation? Think about what you would need to know if you came across a first aid emergency, and we'll talk a little bit about that. All right, first off, a first aid supply kit should include bandages, antiseptic ointment, aspirin, tweezers, and disposable gloves, prescription pain medications, or antibiotics. And I think in today's environment with what's going on, you would know that that's disposable gloves. It's something that should be in a first aid kit. We'll talk a little bit about that under universal precautions. Okay, we're going to identify ways to prepare for an emergency situation, which is important that you kind of think about it before you actually encounter a first aid situation. What will I do instead of being panicked? We'll talk about the universal precautions, the 4 emergency guidelines, what that is and what you need to take, and we'll go over the sequence of evaluating an injured person. We'll also in the process define those key words. You can go ahead and read those real quickly and move on. Okay, in this game, actually, I'm going to do a true-false because this does not work. But I've got it in a Word document. So, I'm going to go through these statements, and I want you to think if these are true or false. In number 1 up there, in most localities, an ambulance will arrive in a few minutes. So there's no need for most people to learn first aid or CPR. Is that true or false? And that one is actually false. We've come quite, complacent in believing that the ambulance will get there quickly. But in many situations, you need to know the immediate steps you've got to take in order to save someone's life. Oftentimes, the ambulances will not be there in time. It's what you take in those immediate actions in those critical situations that can save a person's life. So that one is false. Okay, 2. Most injuries do not require life-saving first aid efforts. That's true. Most don't. Most do not. But they still require you to administer some sort of first aid to try to help that person. Number 3. Call for an ambulance and seek medical care for all injured victims. And that one is false. Obviously, you got to make an assessment whether or not you need to get that ambulance. In your readings today, which I'll assign to you, it goes through that. We'll talk about, the need for call to help and when you need to make that call. So not necessary for all injured victims. That one is false. In most situations, giving first aid, the victim must give you consent, which is permission. Is that true or false? And that is true. If the person is conscious and they do not want first aid, even though you recognize they need it, they got to give you consent before you can move on. In most. But if they're unconscious, that's a different situation. 5. A scene survey must be done before giving first aid to an injured victim, and that is true. And what a scene survey is, you're looking for the hazard. What is there any additional hazards out there that may injure myself? Oftentimes a lot of people go running into a situation, and the hazard that originally injured the person still exists, and then the first aid provider is also injured. You're doing that person no good if you do not initially do that scene survey to determine if the hazards have been removed or if there's any other additional hazards. like in a road, the cars come along. Many people have tried to administer first aid, and then they get hit by a car because they did not do a scene survey. So obviously it must be done. That's true. Number 6, most communities use the 911 telephone number for emergencies. That is true. There's very few communities out there that do not have that. Obviously in our area, 911 does exist, and that would be used for emergencies. A scene survey purpose is to find life-threatening conditions. Well, we just talked about that, so obviously that's exactly true. Okay, everyone will at some time have to make the decision whether to help another person. Is that true or false? That's true. Over your lifetime, you probably already have had to, provide someone some sort of assistance, even if it's in a minor first aid. But you need to be prepared because at some point in your life, you may have to give someone life-saving first aid. And you should, now is the time for you to learn that. And that's why we go over these in these classes, from mouth-to-mouth resuscitations to CPR, the Heimlich maneuver, whatever, which is helping someone that's choking. It's critical that you understand those sort of procedures because you at some point may come across that, and it may be even a loved one, a family member, whatever it may be, and you're going to have to respond to save their lives. So that's why this class is so important that we go through these things. So obviously 8 is true. Okay, 9, correct first aid can mean the difference between life and death. True or false? And that's true. That is true. And today in your readings, you're going to go under and look at the, gathering information and the 7 critical life-saving steps and really understanding those steps and doing them the proper way will determine sometimes in emergency situations whether or not that person could potentially survive or die. So this is the type of class you should really be paying attention to, and you really need to do the reading because if you're ever put into a situation, you want to do those right steps. Do we look for bleeding first? Do we look for breathing first? Do we look for heartbeat first? That's all in our readings today. And we're going to go over that. It's critical that we understand how we assess those emergency situations so we can provide that person that critical first aid. So that 9 is true. 10, crying or screaming victims must be treated before quiet ones. And that one is false. If you come across an accident, for instance, the person that may be unconscious may need that critical care first. Just because the person's crying or screaming, they're not necessarily the one that needs the immediate care. They probably do need some sort of assistance, but you need to go through and make the proper assessments, and it may be someone else that needs that. So obviously number 10, that is false. All right. Continue on with our presentation. Okay, so we need to think about the most important things you should do in an emergency situation. So what is first aid? And this is from your inspection questions. So you should know this definition. It's the immediate care given to an injured or ill individual to keep him or her alive or stop further damage until qualified medical treatment can be administered. So if that ever is asked of you, really the immediate care you provide until qualified medical treatment can be administered. Being prepared for an emergency means knowing your emergency phone numbers, which in our area is 911. Also, you should probably have a good understanding. Oftentimes, emergency situations happen with your family. So you should understand their drug allergies or their health records or anything that's occurring because the emergency personnel may be asking you, what does this person have any allergies? What is their medical records? How's do they have anything that's, illnesses or anything that's affecting them? And you should also know, like at your house, where your first aid supplies are located. Or like in your workplace, where the first aid supplies are located. I know, like at the school, where the AED is, where the stop bleed kits are. You don't want to start panicking looking for that stuff when an emergency situation happens. You need to know where it is and immediately go get it. All right, just watch this here on first aid kits.
A first aid kit is a selection of supplies for giving first aid. First aid kits have different contents depending on who has put the kit together. You can buy a kit or put one together yourself. Some of the typical items found in a first aid kit include instruments such as tweezers and scissors, equipment such as a thermometer, cotton swabs, blanket, and cold pack, medications to include antiseptic ointment, sterile eye wash, activated charcoal, hydrogen peroxide, and aspirin, dressings for wounds such as gauze pads, adhesive tape, and adhesive bandages, as well as additional miscellaneous items such as a small flashlight, tissues, hand sanitizers, disposable gloves, and a face mask for rescue breathing.
All right, so that's about first aid kits. Good information. Like it says, you can either buy those whole or you can put those together. And if your family doesn't have one, that'd be a good conversation to have about, hey, maybe we should have a first aid kit at the house in case of an emergency. Okay, why do you think a kit would include gloves and a breathing mask? In today's COVID age, that answer is almost pretty obvious. Before this COVID came, many people weren't aware of the universal precautions that you need to take to stop the spread of certain diseases, and the use of the gloves to protect you from the certain contaminated body fluids, and a breathing mask to keep you from contacting any illnesses that they may have. And that's why you should have those sort of things in a first aid kit. That might be one of the benefits from COVID, that we actually now think about those sort of things. Many people weren't aware that those sort of things could spread. And that's where we talk about universal precautions. And before this was universal, and we needed to talk about it, many people weren't aware of it. But we need to take universal, the gloves, the masks, breathing things to prevent the spread of diseases, and the blood, that's contaminated, that could get into our system and get us ill. And that's why commercial first aid kits contain gloves and the breathing masks if you have to do mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. So that is what universal precautions are. Okay, the guidelines for emergency, guys. These are the 4 big things that you need to understand in emergency situations. This is what you take. First, you got to recognize the signs of an emergency. You got to use your senses out there, but you need to be aware of all that. People shouting, loud noises, something happened, smoke. That should really alert you to that there's potentially an emergency situation going on. All right. Once you recognize that, the second thing is just as important. You need to remove immediate dangers. You need to do a site survey and recognize, hey, what caused that person to get injured? Are there any other hazards out there? A lot of times, when there's an accident on the road, you've got to be aware that going into the road or trying to rush to the scene, you could potentially get injured. So you need to do that site survey and remove any other dangers to protect yourself, because you're no good if you get injured yourself. Only move the injured person if they're in immediate danger. And the Good Samaritan laws are that if you in good faith are trying to administer first aid to someone, you are protected from a lawsuit from them coming after you later on. As long as you're not a qualified medical personnel and you're going there to help them, you are protected by the Good Samaritan laws. Last is you're going to gather information, take action, and call for help if needed. And those are the big things that we're going to, 3 and 4 is going to be done in your reading. Believe it right here. Gather information, take action, call help if needed. That's pages 152 to 157. And I'm going to stop the presentation here because I want you to go to the unit text and read those areas, which is very important. We'll